Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
This story begins in a very beautiful place, namely in the village of the Elder. One day, a little girl came to a man who was sitting and sorting through his papers for work and addressed him immediately. As soon as the man saw her, he was immediately very surprised and asked why she suddenly decided to come. And this little girl, handing him a paper, wondered if he could sign this paper for her. In fact, on that paper was a document canceling the donation that her father wanted to make, and she would like this man to put his signature on it. The man immediately took the paper and began to study it, and then asked if he really had to do this again for her father, and also, laughing, said that he did not believe that a daughter fulfills every request of her father. The man thought this was even amazing, but turning to her, he said that her father had already promised to make a donation, so it would be a little difficult to cancel. So he gave her the paper and said that unfortunately, he could not help her anymore. There was no way back for him. As soon as the girl heard this, she became very upset. Tears appeared in her eyes, and she asked him to make an exception for them at least once. The man insisted on his own and said that cancellations of donations this year were rare, and he was definitely going to check everything more carefully in the future. However, when this cutie looked at him with such a look, he simply could not resist, and said that in this case it would be the last time. He would not allow this to happen again. As soon as the little girl finally got the right signature, she ran home and was incredibly happy. She laughed all the time and even hummed some melody because her soul was simply very happy. But in fact, she was not at all surprised that everything turned out the way she wanted, because her irresistible charm always overcomes stubbornness. But then suddenly, while she was running through the forest, she stopped and looked at the paper. She understood that in any case, her dad was too kind, and these were his problems. But the girl didn't understand how he could suddenly decide to donate such an incredibly huge amount to the village when they themselves didn't have much money to feed themselves. She walked slowly on, realizing that instead of giving away money that they didn't have, they had to save up some money to buy land and build a house. She also believed that she needed to hire workers there and make her life much easier. But even despite all these mistakes of her father, she still loved him madly and was very proud that he was such a kind, generous person. She simply decided that she would take care of him forever and control his every move all the time, especially when it came to money, because in this regard he could be incredibly generous. And then suddenly, when she walked further, she saw a Cayenne not far from her. She immediately waved to two young guys who were walking towards her. The man in the straw hat immediately greeted the girl and said that she was wearing an incredibly beautiful dress, and asked if it was new, since he had never seen one like it before. The girl, continuing to walk further, smiled and said that her father made it for her, and it was really very beautiful, so she happily loved to wear it. In fact, this little beautiful girl's name was Xian, and her eyes were like round pieces of green meadow. And this beautiful girl's hair looked like cotton candy, was just as fragrant, and even her cheeks looked like they were about to explode from juice if you bit them. Sienna really was an incredibly charming child with all of these qualities and more. Sure, it might sound a little boastful, but she really couldn't help it. The girl loved her looks incredibly much and wasn't going to hide it. In fact, Sienna found herself in the world of a novel called The Life of Melody. She had recently read it, but only halfway through. It was truly a fantastic story about the journey of Saint Melody, but in this world, Sienna was neither a saint nor a princess as one might expect. She got the role of just an ordinary girl who lived in a quiet village with her incredibly kind and sensitive father. At first, of course, it was incredibly difficult for her to adapt to the baby's body. However, now the girl felt that her mind was merging with this life more often, and she was increasingly forgetting what it was like before. In fact, the being that gave her this new life also gave her an obstacle that forces her to play her role too much. She quite often finds herself speaking in a childish manner, with a tone much younger than her age. However, for now, Sienna has decided that she will fully enjoy the life she has. The girl did not fully understand how this happened and what would happen next, but she knew one thing. She could not influence it in any way. So she decided to just let the situation go. When Sienna was returning home, she remembered that she was supposed to have meat dishes for dinner that day. She really hoped that her dad would come home soon and have time to have dinner with her as well. And besides all this, a big inconvenience for the girl was the fact that due to the fact that this was a small body, it got tired quite quickly, and she almost always wanted to sleep. In order to rest a little, the girl climbed onto the fence and sat there for a while, when suddenly some knights approached her. They immediately approached her and asked if there was anyone adult in her house. Sienna was very surprised and immediately asked why they suddenly needed adults, and the man answered that they were looking for a guy with black hair and red eyes. As soon as the girl heard this, she immediately panicked. She understood that these people were very suspicious, so she quickly replied that there was no one with a similar appearance in this place. In fact, she knew this man very well. It was a complete description of her father's appearance, and she realized that he was in danger. Indeed, when it came to Sienna's father, he was the kindest man in the world, the purest and most good-natured. However, at the same time, this made him easy prey for all those people who like to profit from such people. Therefore, there were many failures and betrayals in this man's life. However, they still did not break him. He continued to do good because he felt so in his soul. Of course, despite all of Sienna's warnings, he always ended up being used, and he suffered very great losses not only for himself, but for his entire family. He was such a good man that he even took on other people's debts because he felt he had to do so. But now she began to doubt what he was doing. Sienna even thought that he had taken on such a big task that he had to involve people in knightly uniform. Sienna knew perfectly well that she had to somehow get out of this situation and send them away cleverly so that they wouldn't have any suspicions and so that they wouldn't come back again. She was silent for a while. Then the man in the knight's uniform suddenly realized that they needed to explain to the girl in more detail and said that they had come to this place based on the report. Another knight confirmed that everything was correct, and this location matched their data. They were about to add something, but they didn't have time because Sienna spoke first. She said that she didn't really know anything about it and didn't want to continue these unpleasant conversations. The girl made a very sweet face and said that they should leave immediately. The knights at that moment fell silent and began to look at her in surprise, clearly not trusting her. Sienna was shocked to see this. She even panicked, realizing that her method had not worked for the first time. Of course, it had always worked, but now for some reason they did not listen to her the first time. Then Sienna decided to adjust the situation a little. Turning away from them, she said that he was not alone. There were many of them, and they had weapons, so she was very afraid. However, the men interrupted her words at that moment. They almost squealed with happiness, declaring that she was an incredibly sweet and very beautiful girl. At that moment, Sienna realized that her plan had worked after all. She immediately smiled and thanked them for such kind words. But in reality, she considered them to be real idiots, since they fell for such a simple deception. One of the knights turned to his companion and asked what they should do now. They did not know if they should retreat now. Sienna was incredibly proud of herself at that moment. After all, she was able to save her father again, even in the body of a small child. Of course, she was going to ask her father about what was going on and why these men were coming for him when he returned. She also needed to think of additional ways to protect herself soon, otherwise it might not work so easily next time. Even if her father had fallen into incredibly bad and dangerous company, she still wasn't going to back down and wanted to do everything she could to protect him. Some time passed from that moment, and the girl suddenly heard someone calling her. However, the knight still remained nearby, not knowing what to do. Sienna turned her head to the side and immediately saw that her father was returning straight to the house. She was very scared and realized that he should not return now under any circumstances. She tried to convey this to him with all possible gestures. Of course, she could not scream. Firstly, it would arouse suspicion among the knights, and secondly, he simply would not hear her. But when the man started getting closer and closer, she realized that he most likely did not understand the signals she was giving him. Then the girl realized that now everything could end very badly. At this moment, a man with dark hair and red eyes was approaching the house faster and faster, assuming that something dangerous could have happened to his daughter. Sienna was very upset about this because the knights were about to leave, but now everything changed. As soon as the man approached his daughter, he immediately hugged her tightly. Turning to these suspicious people, he asked who they were and what they were doing here. Sienna couldn't believe he was letting himself get into trouble so easily. If it came to the worst, her father could get hurt, and the girl didn't want that at all. At that moment, she began to get angry and even thought about punishing these people with her fiery fists if everything turned into a fight. However, one of the knights suddenly bowed low, greeted the man, and explained that they had come to deliver a message to the first Prince of Mirmord, Prince Matthias. He added that the message said that Matthias needed to stop his little game and return immediately. Sienna, hearing this, was so shocked that her mouth dropped open. She couldn't believe her ears. The girl knew well about the Duchy of Mermord and was shocked. This place was considered to be the home of the most terrible creature in the entire empire. Murders and other heinous acts were committed there, which were not punished in any way, and sometimes were even encouraged. Sienna sincerely hoped that the knights were mistaken, because her father could not have been connected with this terrible place. She hugged him tighter and looked into his eyes, but at that moment she saw a scared, but at the same time serious man. They were silent for a while. Then her father told the knights in a rough voice that he understood everything and asked them to tell him that he would come. Sienna was horrified. She couldn't believe he said something like that right in front of her. She remembered that at the end of the book, the Mermord family met a terrible end. They were executed, and everyone watched it. Before their execution, they were brutally tortured, and the death of each family member caused jubilation among thousands of people. Sienna knew very well about this terrible fate, and could not believe that events began to develop so quickly. The Mermord family was the most despised and feared in the empire. Even within their house, the struggle for power never ceased, and daily deaths were commonplace. And now, after that terrible message from the knights, Sienna, together with her father, arrived at the castle that belonged to the infamous Mermord family. The girl rode in the carriage next to her father, looking out the window all the time. She understood perfectly well that this would not end well, but she did not know what to do. At that moment, her father, with a smile on his face, suddenly turned to her, asking if she was okay. He noticed that she looked a little pale. Even in such a difficult situation, he remained incredibly positive and said that he hoped she did not get sick on such an important day. However, what bothered Sienna most was that there was no character named Matthias in the novel, even though the knights mentioned him. When they finally got there, the father went out first and picked up his daughter so that she would not lag behind and would be close all the time. Sienna understood how gentle her father's character was, and even suggested that perhaps he was just a secondary character who could be quickly eliminated. As they walked further and further, the girl looked around and became more and more convinced that her father did not fit into this family at all. That's why she had doubts. Why did he come here? Sienna assumed that he was probably invited back after he voluntarily left for the village. She knew her father was not the type to get involved in a fight for the inheritance. He simply backed down to avoid conflict. Even though the man kept smiling and trying to cheer up his daughter, Sienna remained adamant. Her face turned red from the anger she felt. She knew that her father was one of those who would willingly give up any position, even the most profitable one. Sienna also understood that if the villain started to bully him, he would not resist, but would simply endure until the end. The thought alone made her despair. She tried to push it away, taking a deep breath and switch her attention to something else. Her father, noticing her sad expression, anxiously asked what she was thinking about, since she had not spoken to him once since the beginning of the trip. At the same time, he began to braid her hair so that it would not get in the way. Sienna did not immediately hear his question and asked again. In fact, the girl was incredibly curious about how they could survive in such a terrible and gloomy place. When they came to the banquet hall, where there were many plates, it turned out that they were alone there. The man stroked her head and said that she was probably very tired after the long journey in the carriage. Smiling, he suggested that she sleep a little to regain her strength. Then he said they could talk about everything. Sienna was shocked to hear this proposal. She couldn't believe that he was so careless about what was happening, because she was most concerned about their chance of survival. In ordinary life, the girl was the simplest inhabitant of the village, who spent her days catching crayfish with her father on the lake. Or maybe I didn't like it very much, eating a stewed meat dish with modest dreams and philosophical conversations over dinner. But now that she was in this place, Sienna knew she had no choice. As someone living a second life, she was going to make the most of every second of her experience. She was going to do whatever it took to get back the happy life she had with her father that they had recently had, and that had been taken away so abruptly. So she turned to her father and said to him that she would protect him no matter what, and would always do so. Sienna knew that when the doors to the auditorium opened and the villains emerged, they would both be in danger. But the girl was not going to be afraid, all because this was already her second life, and she knew what was what and did not want to endanger her father. As soon as she said those words and hugged him, the man immediately smiled and said that she was not obligated to protect him at all. He stroked her head and said that, on the contrary, it was his duty as a father to protect her, and that was what he would do. At that moment, his voice sounded incredibly rough, and Sienna couldn't even believe that her dad said that. In fact, her father's arms, which hold and embrace her all the time, are her sanctuary. in which she is ready to remain for eternity. And no matter what life situations happened to her, at any time she would come to her father, and he would hug her with these soft hands, and then her soul would feel light. Sienna guessed that maybe it was because his arms were huge, or because they were thick and quite strong. And even though he wasn't a boxer, the veins were visible. It was a sign of the hard life he had to live. Every wound that people had inflicted on his hands was visible, even though he had done good to them. Every scar showed that this man had had a hard life. Therefore, Sienna, looking at Anne, said in a confident voice that she would not go back on her words and would definitely protect him. The man laughed and said he didn't understand how she was going to do that because she couldn't even speak properly, and that's why he wanted to protect her. After this, Anne began to tickle her and said that he would do this until she said that she understood everything. When the girl had no more strength to laugh, she smiled and said that she agreed, but she would still defend him. The man did not insist on his own and said that, of course, her father may not be the best person, but he hoped that Sienna was happy when he was around and that the time they spent together was the best for her. He stroked her cheek, tickling her even more, and said that he really hoped his daughter would be happy and healthy. He also really wanted her to live like a normal child, to enjoy little things and find beauty in everything. As soon as the girl heard this, she immediately frowned. She understood perfectly well that she could not do this. She knew that a good dad like him couldn't protect her, and all because he had this evil family that was ready to tear him to pieces. The man turned to her and asked if she agreed to such a condition. Sian had no choice but to agree, so she just nodded her head. Of course, when her father behaved like this, she had no choice but to give in. If she doesn't play and acts like a child, her father looks a little gloomy. At that moment, Sienna remembered the moment when they were having dinner one evening, and the man asked the girl, "Is she really not going to eat her carrots?" Sienna then told him, with her mouth full, that it tasted terrible and that she really didn't want to eat it. The man then began to look a little serious and said that in that case, the carrots he had named were incredibly upset about it. And he asked her to ask them for forgiveness because they were incredibly offended by this. As soon as Sienna heard this, she was very surprised and asked in disbelief, did she really have to do this? The man at that moment replied that if she did not ask for forgiveness, the carrot would say, "Ouch," and it would hurt her. Of course, the girl was irritated by all this, but she then submitted and asked the carrot for forgiveness, despite the fact that it was rather absurd in her opinion. Of course, on the outside, Sienna was still even less than 5, but on the inside, she was no longer that age, but much older. Her dad always told the girl the same thing, namely that she was a child who deserved to be loved. He always called her a wonderful girl who would achieve many successes if she only wanted it. So Sienna believed him and understood perfectly well that he was saying good things. As they sat in that dark place, the man began to hug his daughter and said that she was the most beautiful girl on earth and made him incredibly happy every day. Sienna understood that, despite the fact that her father was quite a grown man and could stand up for himself, she simply had to protect his innocence and do everything possible to ensure that kindness remained in him forever. And some time passed from that moment. The door to the banquet hall opened, and a rather stern-looking woman entered. The man immediately covered his daughter's face so that she would not be frightened, and he turned to his mother and said that some time had passed since their last meeting. But the woman didn't look so cheerful. She cleared her throat in a rough voice and asked, "Did he really just call her mother?" She also asked with a mocking voice, "Does he really think that she is his real mother?" Then the man asked, "In that case, should he really just call her Daria Rochella?" As soon as Sienna heard all this, she immediately began to look in that direction and did not understand why the reunion turned out to be so tense. She understood perfectly well that this would not be a joyful event, but she did not think that sparks would fly around them from anger. But as soon as the name Daria was pronounced, she immediately realized that this woman was the ruler of the upper tower, and in her youth, she killed all the other wizards. She trained and captured an entire tower of wizards up to the 12th rank, including the 4th. She had an extraordinary talent, and that is why she even became famous among many people. And some not only feared her, but also worshipped her. According to the original story, she is now treated like a pensioner, and the glory she once had is long gone. However, she was once the head of an evil, noble house, and after her father received his blessing, they were able to leave. But now, for some reason, they ended up here again. Sienna, on the other hand, wanted to return to her peaceful life, so she was going to do everything she could to make that happen. The woman, meanwhile, came and sat down opposite them, and also said that now that he had returned, he knew very well that he would not be able to go back on his own. Sienna was very surprised to hear this. However, Daria replied that he understood that he could either become a successor or be exiled and become a fugitive. There was also a third option, namely death. She looked at her son and said that he only had one choice out of three, so he would have to decide. As soon as the girl heard this, she was very surprised and could not believe that if they did not choose the option to escape or become a ruler, then this would be real death. This scared her. She also wouldn't want to agree to him becoming the successor, because it would be incredibly dangerous for her father. She would like with all her might to leave this castle as far away as possible and never return. When the girl moved closer to the man, he even felt her trembling slightly and became a little wary. But after a while, Sienna began to look at Daria with anger. Some people said that even if you get into a tiger's den, you can survive if you keep your wits about you. That's exactly what she was going to do. She had to remain ready so that if something happened, she could seize the right moment and attack this tiger. At that moment, the girl began to pull her father by the hand, and he asked what she was doing. But Sienna didn't answer. In fact, the man was wearing rather torn and dirty clothes only because he spent a lot of money on the best clothes for his daughter all the time. He always found incredibly beautiful and neat t-shirts, dresses, and skirts, everything just so that she would be very beautiful, neat, and cute. At that moment, Anna couldn't care less what he looked like. At the same time, despite the fact that his clothes were ragged, he was still happy that he could give beautiful clothes to his daughter. When Daria noticed her dress, she immediately asked what kind of clothes it was. But Sienna, protesting, replied that it was not just clothes, it was a dress that her father had made especially for her. Of course, the woman was not surprised at all, and she even considered it a little stupid. However, at that moment, Anne answered the woman that this little beautiful girl was his daughter. Then he turned directly to the girl and told her to greet the woman. Sienna immediately bowed and greeted her. Of course, she didn't like doing it, but it was the right thing to do. In her mind, she almost cursed this woman because she knew that she would do many more bad things to them. Of course, Sienna even felt a little despair that she couldn't leave this castle. However, there was one thing she was still very grateful for. She was happy that in her past life she had read the Duchess's strategies in the original work, so she knew perfectly well what she was trying to achieve and how she should act now. Daria suddenly turned to her son and asked him why he had brought this girl with him. The man replied that he wanted to show Sienna to his mother. The woman sighed heavily and said that they would have to talk about it later because she had something to say about the issue of succession. First of all, she was going to tell about his brother's trial, which had been held quite recently. However, the man interrupted her and did not let her finish. He looked at the woman with an angry look and said that he thought it would be better to talk about it a little later. But Sienna had already heard about some strange case of demons about the inheritance, and she immediately became interested in what was going on there. In fact, it was the first time she had heard about it. There was no mention of it in the story. She even assumed that she might have skipped that part, considering it unimportant to the main plot. Then she tried to remember all the details, but she couldn't. However, at that moment, Sienna looked at Daria, around whom a rather strange glow appeared. The woman said in a quiet voice that his high attitude was still the same. Nothing had changed, and this irritated her. She looked at her son with an angry look and said that she just wanted to crush him because it irritated her more than anything in the world. Of course, Sienna knew that Daria hated being interrupted the most. However, she also thought that her father was a real idiot for continuing to do this. She knew that even if it looked pretty impressive, it didn't mean it would work. It wasn't enough. So if things continued at this pace, she knew she wouldn't be able to leave this estate the way she wanted. Sienna also began to think that eventually, if her father continued to behave like this, she would become just ordinary food for crows. Of course, there was no way she was going to let that happen. Sienna thought she would have to pull out the card she had up her sleeve to save this situation. So Sienna got up from her chair and, taking her father's hand, said that she would be back very soon. As soon as the man heard this, he immediately became worried. He asked in a trembling voice where she was going to go, because, of course, she did not know this castle. But Sienna wasn't listening to him anymore. She started running straight to Daria's part of the table, and the woman decided to joke and asked how it was possible for a honey jar to run. But Sienna had her own plan, so she stopped next to the old woman and, making a sweet expression, called her grandmother. The man, of course, immediately became afraid for his daughter, because he understood that his mother could react very unusually to such a manifestation of love. But Sienna didn't stop. She asked if it was true that being her father's mother meant that she was her grandmother. And at that moment, the girl smiled. When she didn't get an answer, she reached out to the woman with her arms forward to hug her and said she was incredibly happy to meet her. All the while, she continued to call Daria her grandmother. Sienna also started walking around her chair and asking her various questions. She asked if her grandmother didn't even want to look at her, and why she didn't talk to them, and all that stuff. Sienna believed that such an operation could work, and she really hoped that the woman would look at her carefully and give in when she saw that cute face. However, Daria meanwhile continued to just look ahead coldly. She didn't even turn her head and completely ignored the girl, as if she didn't exist at all. Of course, Sienna was very upset that her plan was starting to fail in this way. However, she had to think of something else urgently. In fact, when the girl read the book, it was mentioned that Daria looked at the remains of the offenders of the Thieves' Guild. In the midst of this horror, there was a feeling as if there was no life left at all. However, she secretly helped the children escape through a secret passage, and no one in the world knew about it. The ruthless ruler of the top of the tower showed mercy, and of course, no one could even imagine such a thing. Therefore, people did not think that it was she who did such a noble act. It was this passage that made the story about Daria stick in Sienna's mind. The girl believed that if her guess was correct, then Daria had a soft spot for children. Of course, absolutely all the children on the continent were simply terrified of Duchess Daria. When they saw her, they always ran away screaming and crying. And even children from evil families ran away, calling her an evil sorceress, despite the fact that they themselves were no less evil. But Sienna turned on all her charm and turned to her grandmother, saying that she missed her incredibly. The girl tried to melt this icy heart. She smiled and asked if Daria missed them. And at that moment, Daria finally looked at Sienna. She immediately became very scared and began to understand those children who ran away from her in horror, because that look was incredibly evil and cold. The girl herself wanted to run away screaming, but she understood that this would ruin the situation. So she remained standing. And so, after some time, the woman finally spoke, saying that she was Duchess Daria, the ruler of the top of the tower, and she was not at all one of those people who could be called a grandmother. Sienna was literally shaking with fear at that moment. She knew she had made a mistake, but she still hoped that deep down this woman had some kindness. She was also surprised that her incredible charm and cuteness did not work on this woman. Now she had to think of something new. Sienna also didn't understand if she should retreat now, but decided that for now it wouldn't be on herself, because at least she managed to distract her attention from her father, at least for a while. In her opinion, this was already quite a big victory, so turning around, the girl returned to her dad, and she looked very worried and sad. Daria, when she saw this, laughed and said that she had now become quite quiet, and also added that she even felt awkward about it. Sienna was irritated by all this, and she thought that she was being scolded for it even now. So she decided to do everything the easy way. The girl looked at her grandmother with a very pitiful look and asked her for forgiveness, saying that she would not do that again, since it made her feel uncomfortable. Of course, Daria was a little surprised at first. However, after that, she said that a lot of time had passed, and not a single child had dared to say such things to her face. When the girl's father took her in his arms, he asked his mother to watch her words, because he did not want Sienna to burst into tears and leave this place depressed. Coming closer to her, he said that he would bring Sienna back so that she would not disturb them, and so that they could normally conduct their conversation as they had planned. Of course, the girl, upon hearing this, was immediately disappointed, and she did not understand how her father could interrupt her grandmother again, knowing that she could not stand it. When Sienna looked at the woman before leaving, she wasn't sure if she would explode with anger this time, because she looked very angry and not cheerful. She grabbed her dad by the shirt and thought that in this case she could try again, because it couldn't get any worse. They would carry her out of the room anyway. So the girl waved, and calling the woman her grandmother again, smiled and said goodbye, saying that she hoped they would meet again. Daria, meanwhile, only glanced at her briefly, and Sienna couldn't believe that she actually paid attention to her this time. While her father was leading her out of the room, the girl was very happy and thought that now she had to take the next step, since Daria had come to meet her. At that moment, she was met by the maid, who was now responsible for the baby for a while, and told her where she needed to go. And the man, closing the door behind him, suddenly heard the voice of his mother, who mockingly asked, did he really call his daughter such a terrible name? But she was forced to admit that the girl was quite grown up. She still remembered how she was born, and now she can already walk and talk, even run. Daria also said that her hair and her facial features, along with this naive stubbornness, all this reminded her of her mother, and this was indeed so. Sienna was incredibly similar to her mother. But these words made the man very angry. He glanced at her and said that she shouldn't worry about Sienna at all. As soon as the woman heard this, she immediately stood up from her seat and laughing asked, why did he even think that she was worried? Daria said that he could relax, because as soon as she lost her innocence, that is, she herself would disappear. And he, even from an early age, had always spoken quite boldly, and this always irritated her. The man smiled and said that she knew his character very well, so she shouldn't be surprised by anything now. Daria stopped in front of him, and making a rude expression on her face, replied that she knew him too well, and that was why she took him in order to use him as a pawn. His character was suppressed by the dead woman and the daughter she had protected for years, and this did not suit Daria at all. She explained that the two of them had lost almost everything. However, they still had the most precious thing imaginable, so it was no wonder that she had become so strong and ruthless at the same time. However, at this point, she moved closer to him and asked him not to forget that many villages inside and outside the family did not agree with him and were therefore ready to fight. However, the man replied that all this was only thanks to her devilish exploits, and he did not plan to play along with anyone. He did not intend to be a pawn in her hands. The man at that moment clenched his fist, and all his scars became even more visible. Then, through clenched teeth, he said that, especially while his daughter was still here, he would fight with all his might. At that moment, Daria, sighing heavily, put her hand on his shoulder and said that she understood everything, and then suggested that he begin preparing to train his successor because he would need it. She also said that he absolutely had to wash that naive little jar of honey thoroughly before training, because he definitely couldn't show up looking like that. At this time, there were some maids with Sienna, and they said that they had been waiting for her all this time since she arrived. In fact, in medieval fantasy novels, maids were usually depicted as incredibly polite, friendly girls who were willing to fulfill their mistress's every whim. They were ready to give her any delicacies, always pour fresh hot tea, and also do everything the way she wanted. All these maids in the novel were described as fragile girls who could only wear their uniforms and look after children. However, in real life, when the maids came to Sienne, they turned out to be completely different. The maids turned to the girl and said that it was a great honor for them to serve her, and they were incredibly happy that they could do this. However, when the girl turned her head and saw the maid-mates, she was very surprised, because these were not the kind of maids she had always read about. These maids were incredibly pumped up, muscular, and very strong. They bowed and said that they were her maids and would now serve her, carrying out any order. However, Sienna should have expected that the two maids of the evil Duke would be on a completely different level, not only mentally, but also physically. The girl was a little confused at first. However, with a trembling voice, she said that she was very glad to meet them, and also called them her great and noble servants. Sienna tried to calm herself down by saying that she had absolutely no reason to be afraid of these people, because she was technically of a higher rank than them, and they certainly shouldn't do her any harm or trouble. Then one of the maids turned to Lady Sienna and said that they would now take her to the spire. The girl, hearing this, was very surprised and asked what it meant, and the maid replied that everything was correct. Her living quarters were in the northern spire, and that was where they would go so that she could see her room. As soon as Sienna heard this, she immediately became very scared because this was the worst possible development. In fact, the northern spire of the Duchy of Maud was a place that was historically used for executions, and where low-ranking members of the bloodline lived out their last days before they were killed. So the girl was naturally very surprised that she was sent to that place. The maids accompanied Sienna, and meanwhile she did not understand why she had to do this, and also could not believe that her grandmother would actually kill them. She also thought that her naive father probably didn't even suspect anything about this. So she urgently needed to somehow get out of this situation. Sienna simply had to dispel the shadow of death that hung over this place, so she quickly began to climb the stairs to get to her room as quickly as possible. However, as soon as she climbed a few meters higher, she was already tired and did not understand why there were so many stairs in this place. She also thought that she would die right there, because she simply would not be able to get there. Then Sienna finally stopped. She apologized to her maids, but with a sweet expression on her face, she replied that her legs were incredibly sore and asked if they could take care of her. Of course, the girl hoped that these maids would be able to carry her to the top, However, one of the maids replied that physical health is mental health, and they were proud of their fitness, so they were not going to indulge lazy swindlers. Sienna was very surprised at this moment, because she did not understand how they could refuse her at all, because they were her servants. She also considered, of course, this whole situation unfair. As she continued to climb higher, she really hoped that she wouldn't suffocate due to lack of oxygen. And she also didn't understand what she was supposed to do in this place at all, since even the maids didn't want to help her even get up there. When they finally got to the top, Sienna leaned against the wall and began to breathe very heavily. A maid turned to her and said that they had finally reached her room so she could come in. The maid opened the doors next to her, and then let the girl into a very cold, dirty, and shabby empty room. As soon as Sienna walked inside, she was incredibly surprised, and the maid replied that it was not completely cleaned yet, so she needed to wait at least one more day before everything was ready. The girl was simply furious at that moment. She did not understand how they could put a small child of her status in such a garbage dump. She began to approach and examine the room from all sides and could not believe that this was really the same duchy that there were so many rumors about, and that this was exactly how people treated nobles. Sienna even jumped from the rage she felt and thought for a while that these were such petty methods of torture, and this was just in Daria's style. However, her pride was more important than protecting her father. She was not going to tolerate all this, so she had to think of something to change everything. The girl understood that these maids who were nearby were definitely in cahoots with her father's enemies. She also tried to remember if anything was said about them in the original novel. As the maids left and slammed the door behind them, Sienna thought that the first thing she needed to do was get out of this terribly smelly room. She simply couldn't even think about anything normally in this stench. However, as soon as the girl touched the door handle, her hand got dirty with something. She looked at her hand and stood there for a moment in stupor. After that, Sienna was happy and realized that she had found what she needed. Sometime before they arrived at this estate, Sienna became quite ill. She had a high temperature. In the evening, when it was time to sleep, her father put her to bed, and stroking her head, the man said that he was very glad that her fever was gradually beginning to subside. Even though the girl felt absolutely terrible, she replied that she was fine, just so that he wouldn't worry. Also, closing her eyes due to extreme fatigue, she said that he also needed to rest, so it was time for him to sleep. But the man didn't want to listen to all this. He covered the girl with a blanket and said that her father would sleep next to her in case something happened. So she shouldn't worry, it would be better to rest herself. Sienna, turning on her back, asked him for forgiveness and said that she was very sorry because she felt absolutely terrible and could not get over it. As soon as the man heard these words, he immediately felt incredibly sorry that he simply couldn't do anything to help Sienna, and also that she had to feel guilty even when she was sick. Some time passed from that moment, and Sienna, when she began to feel better, went to work to her. He saw that she was standing on her feet and immediately asked, "Has she really gotten much better?" When the girl shook her head, he came closer and said that many people say that eating the fruit from the tree makes the body stronger and healthier. And that is why he prepared some fruits for her, so that she would not get sick anymore. As soon as Sienna heard this, she already wanted to say something, but she didn't have time, because the man, smiling, offered to live long and healthy together from now on, because he didn't want her to suffer from such severe colds anymore. At that very time, in the dark duchy, the maids were in the bathroom and preparing it just in order to thoroughly wash the girl. One of the maids began to stretch her hand upward and told her partner that stretching was a very important part of preparing the water for the bath. Another agreed with her, and also doing stretching, said that if they do nothing, they will simply lose their amazing muscle mass. Then she came closer to the other one and, showing her biceps, asked if she thought they had become a little bigger. Her friend agreed and said that she had set a new personal record for heavy lifting that day and just wanted to gain some more mass to become even better. And so, after some time, the bath was finally filled, and steam even started coming out of it. The temperature there was so warm. When the maid noticed this, she said that if they had this magic powder, their muscles would become even stronger. Because they did not have it, they became very sad. In fact, there was a special protein that was for gym lovers, and it grew on the world's trees. It was this that helped people pump up and earn their muscle mass much faster. And that ingredient was the legendary powder from the fruit of the coconut tree, which, unfortunately, is not so easy to obtain. Some time ago, they managed to get their hands on a small amount of this powder, and they were able to very quickly transform from very skinny and weak maids into incredibly muscular and strong ones. Sienna, who was outside the door at that moment, overheard their conversation. They also talked about how absolutely everyone was trying to accumulate more of it and then build their body, the dream that had been in their heads for so long. But despite the fact that this powder was incredibly expensive, they still wanted to get their hands on it very much. However, their salary could not even afford a drop of this miraculous substance. The maid replied that she knew it very well, and then sighed heavily. Then Sienna decided to take advantage of the opportunity and went out to them, asking if she could bring them some water. The maid said that everything was correct and also added that she would help the girl change her clothes. In fact, as Sienna expected, these maids were incredibly cold and distant towards a person like her. However, if she were a muscular child, she would even think that they might be a lot kinder to her. When Sienna finally got into the bath, she crawled closer to the maid and said that her muscles were just amazing. The maid was a little surprised by her words, but thanked her for the compliment. When Sienna was being heavily soaped and having her dirt scrubbed off with a washcloth, she suddenly wondered if she had anything in the village that could strengthen such muscles for a long time. She thought for a moment and said that she thought there were some instruments there. However, she then realized that it was not that at all. It was something similar to medicine. And then suddenly Sienna said exactly what the maids wanted to hear. She replied that it was free fruit powder that grew right on the trees. As soon as the maids heard this, they immediately stopped and looked at her in surprise. They immediately asked, "Is she really talking about powder?" Sienna was delighted that they had taken her bait and smiled and said that it was true. She had an incredible amount of coconut powder at home, and this place was really too harsh to grow such fruit. At this very time, it was already completely dark outside, and Sienna's father had already freed himself from talking with his mother and was heading to the very place that had been allocated to him and his daughter. As soon as he entered, he immediately realized that it would be incredibly dangerous for Sienna to live in this terrible castle. He started to climb the steps very quickly to finally meet his daughter. He knew that this place was too high for a girl like her, and therefore he was worried that something dangerous could happen at any moment. He was especially frightened by the maids who worked in this tower. After all, they were, according to rumors, the Cerberuses of the North Tower. These girls really were incredibly dangerous and stern. As soon as the man finally got over all those numerous steps, he immediately opened the door to the room and, turning to Sienna, asked if everything was okay with her, and also if she felt well. But as soon as he entered, he did not see his daughter at first, but only the maids, who blocked his entire view with their huge muscular backs. Of course, he immediately became very scared, and did not understand what they were doing there, and also assumed that perhaps someone had bribed them, and they were now plotting something terrible. He knew that if that was really the case, he needed to deal with them immediately and take his daughter back. However, at that moment he heard Sienna's joyful voice, which suggested that they move on. The maid stood up, and Sienna, who was already washed and tidied up, raised her hand and said that Lady Sienna was incredibly noble, and that was why she deserved the best. Meanwhile, the maids continued to hold her in their arms and repeated everything she said about how noble, good, and beautiful she was. The man, meanwhile, stood to the side and just watched all this for a while because he was very surprised. In fact, as expected, even these callous maids have completely submitted to Sienna's incredible cute appearance and are now ready to serve her forever. When the girl finished her battle cry, she smiled and said that she was now ready to ask her final question. Did they really want her to bring them coconut fruit mud? She also said that she trusted only them, and that was why she would do it. Meanwhile, the father continued to stand in the doorway and watch all this. He simply smiled, because he was pleased to see that his daughter had finally found a common language, even with such people. After some time of silence, he turned to the girl and asked her, was she really able to find something in common even with older women? As soon as Sienna saw her dad, she immediately ran to him. He grabbed her in his arms and they began to hug, and he replied that he still hoped that she would spend this day with him. Sienna, of course, said that she would. She would always sleep with him and never leave him alone, because he was the best person. Then the man continued to smile, suggested that they go to his room, and also asked that she say goodbye to the older girls, and then they could rest. Sienna smiled before leaving and said that they would see each other again. After that, her father turned her around and they started to leave. However, the man warned them with gestures that if they were not careful with their words, their lives would be over, and he would not even care that they were his mother's maids. Some time passed since then, and now they finally came out of the bathroom. Sienna, meanwhile, was incredibly pleased with what she had achieved. The girl, smiling happily, thought that they were such innocent maids and could easily believe her words. In fact, when her father planted the fruit, she didn't even know what it was. However, after eating it, she was pleased to know that she wouldn't feel sick anymore because the coconut was soothing to her stomach. But in any case, the fact that the coconut was growing peacefully in their yard played into her hands very well. And that is why she was now able to find a common language with the maids and attract them to her side. When they finally went to bed, the girl turned to her father and asked him to bring her a lot of coconut fruits. The man covered her with a blanket so that she would not freeze, and said that in this case, he would bring her everything she wanted because he was ready to go to any lengths for the sake of his beloved daughter. Sienna lay down on the pillow, and he asked her if it was true that she needed the coconut fruit that her father had planted for her when she was sick. The girl said that it was true. She loved the fruits that he had planted. In fact, the girl now found the coconut palms that her father had planted for her very useful. Pure and kind dad. But in fact, she was surprised to even think that such an incredibly benevolent person as her father could be the prince of this terrible place. The girl also suggested that he must be incredibly lonely now and find it difficult to cope with all this, because no one will support him on this path. She is still too young to help in any way. However, she still believed that he was not alone, and Sienna was always going to be there to support him at least morally, since she couldn't do it physically because she was a small child. In fact, what she certainly never imagined before her reincarnation was experiencing love and a sense of family. She had never had that before. However, now that she had it, she was incredibly happy, and it was for this reason that the girl was ready to do absolutely anything just not to lose it. The night passed rather calmly and safely, and the next morning Sienna was called to the training hall of the mansion. There, the maids immediately met her and began to train her. They said that the fruits she gave them, they could not break even with their bare hands and ate them immediately. And the other maid replied that once they ate, they were able to do a lot more squats, and their bodies now felt so light, yet quite toned. Sienna, who had actually given them the fruit she had eaten that morning, passed it on to her father. She said it was absolutely delicious and that she was very happy for them. In fact, she thought that these adult women were just monsters. Then the maid, after a short silence, said that she also needed to get special training, because it was very important. But she also warned the girl that the Duchess must be informed about any such events, so they would have to be told. Sienna did not object, and said that they should wait a little while until she finished doing her important business. The maid stayed in the training grounds, and the girl ran away. In fact, the weather was simply delightful, and the garden she went to was also beautiful. As Sienna ran towards the gazebo, she saw many people around. She immediately assumed that they were guests who had come specifically for the excursion. She also wondered if there was anyone among these people who would study with her. She really hoped that it would be a nice person and would become her friend, because there are never too many good people around. And then suddenly, Sienna, stopping next to the children, saw that they were looking at her without taking their eyes off her, a boy and a girl. She was a little surprised by this. However, she immediately smiled sweetly and waved to them in greeting. However, these children were not happy about this. One of them sighed heavily, the other, turning around, said that she was staring at them, and this irritated him. Then the girl said that she had heard that she was a celebrity. However, as she was leaving, she also said that this girl was much more beautiful than she thought, and this was not a joy for her. But the guy explained that she had such an unusual appearance only because the blood of a cursed evil woman was mixed in her veins, and it was all an evil force. The other children who were there and heard everything said that they heard that her mother had one too, which means that her father must die. Then one of the kids laughed and said that she would probably just become a homeless freak that no one needed. After that, they sighed heavily and said that she was so unlucky, and also that it was very sad. But Sienna, as soon as she heard all these words, was very offended. Tears even began to well up in her eyes, and she could not believe that children could be so cruel. They continued to talk among themselves. One of the girls asked why she was being so cruel if she was going to die anyway. And the boy who was standing next to her replied that he thought it was her father who made her do this, because people like them absolutely should not be near their families. Sienna couldn't believe that they were actually saying things like that even in her presence. And at that moment, she felt simply humiliated and terribly upset. However, at that moment, she remembered her father, who always supported her and was always on her side. Once, when the girl's arm became very swollen while she was in the garden, he immediately became worried and asked, Had she really been stung? He even had tears in his eyes. That's how much he was worried about his daughter. He told Sienna that she must be in incredible pain because of this, but he immediately treated her bite. So, as soon as she remembered all this, the girl clenched her hand into a fist, and when she heard someone say that all this irritated her, she decided to stand up for herself and asked the girl who did this. Was she really telling her this? However, this did not frighten the children at all. They simply began to laugh at her and did not understand how such a girl with such dirty blood could behave in such a way. They also began to pick on her appearance, calling her eyes cursed and even pretending to be afraid of her. Sienna was even more upset about this, and when she sighed heavily, the children began to laugh, thinking that she was about to cry like a little child. However, this was not the case at all. At that moment, she began to scream very loudly, asking, "Did they really just call her grandmother a villain?" As soon as the children heard her screaming, they immediately became frightened, because at that moment, the maids who were nearby heard all this and were approaching. When they turned their heads to the side and saw these pumped-up maids, they were incredibly scared, so they decided to just run away from that place. One of the maids even started chasing these children, who continued to scream and even cry. Sienna, meanwhile, explained to one of the children, who also called her grandmother names, that she was the granddaughter of the Duchess. However, she was called the villainess's relative. To complete the atmosphere, she even burst into tears. Then one of the children immediately began to defend himself and his friends, saying that it was all just a mistake and they didn't mean anything like that. But Sienna started yelling at her even louder and asked if they really wanted to call her grandmother an idiot. The guy got even more scared and asked why she was saying that, because he didn't even mean it. He just wanted to explain that it was all a misunderstanding, for which he was very sorry. Sienna continued to scream with tears in her eyes and said that he couldn't be serious because the Duchess was her grandmother, and calling her a villain was definitely wrong and terrible in her opinion. She also said that if he insults Sienna's grandmother, he will be in big trouble because no one has the right to speak to her like that. The boy was fed up with all this. He tried to explain, but she didn't let him get a word in, so he swung at the girl, saying that he couldn't stand it anymore. Sienna knew exactly what she was sacrificing, so she simply closed her eyes and hoped for a good reaction from the maids. And it really was like that. One of the maids, who was standing nearby, immediately interrupted the boy's blow, thereby protecting the defenseless girl who was crying. The maid turned to Sienna and asked if she was okay. The girl immediately smiled and thanked her for saving her, saying that she was fine. In fact, he really surprised her, because she didn't expect that this man would be able to hit someone younger than her. She also thought that he was a real idiot, since he raised his hand to someone of her status. Then the girl suddenly asked, "Do they think her grandmother won't find out about the bad things she heard that day?" The boy understood that trouble was inevitable, and the maid replied that she could well find out about it. Sienna then said that she was fine, even though she had to hear such bad words that she did not like at all. She said that she was quite brave, but if her kind grandmother heard such bad words addressed to her, she understood that it could hurt her heart very much. Then she looked sternly at the boy who had bullied her and asked if he even understood all this. After that, the girl said out loud that this should be kept a secret from her grandmother. Of course, Sienna understood perfectly well what she had just done. Namely, she had revealed the skill of spreading rumors throughout the estate. The maids who were standing nearby, as soon as they heard that this was a secret and that they couldn't tell anyone about it, immediately left, talking and discussing the whole situation that had happened. Sienna, when she saw this, immediately knew that this secret would not last long, and was very happy that she had such a wonderful skill. Also, after observing the maids who ran away first, she realized that thanks to this effect, almost everyone would soon find out about it. Of course, if someone says bad things, they should be punished for it according to their merits. You can't get away with it when you offend people. So Sienna was incredibly pleased with herself that she was able to stand up to these kids and thus even get revenge. The girl turned around and started to walk away, thinking that they would probably shut their mouths and just freeze in fear when they found out that this news had started to spread. And besides, now her father will no longer have to hear such terrible things addressed to him. She was able to stand up and defend not only her honor, but also the honor of her father. However, she suddenly looked at the time and realized that she couldn't be distracted by all these trifles for too long, but needed to go to classes, which were about to start very soon. When Sienna arrived there, one of the students was already sitting there, and it was Leonard. The boy had beautiful blue eyes, and he also had a mask on, and he was not very happy that he had to come and attend classes with Duke Matthias's daughter. During the time he had already spent with her in class, the boy had watched closely and noticed that she was quite an interesting person, even despite her age. When Sienna made all that fuss on the street and started defending her rights, he was standing nearby and heard it all, so the girl really interested him. The boy also thought about Duke Matthias, and sighing heavily, realized that it was almost a shame that he would kill her, this little beautiful girl. In fact, this Matthias Mir may have been the strongest and most incredible, as well as the most cruel person in the whole family. This is the kind of person who would kill all of his loved ones if they were of no value to him, so he is truly very dangerous, cunning, and terrible. When Sienna came to class, he turned to her and asked her what her name was. In order to somehow address her, he even called her Chestnut, and Sienna protested and replied that her name was not Chestnut at all, and gave her own name,